Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. It's really good to see so many people here, and thank you to everyone who's joining us online as well. My name's Rachel South, and I manage the bookshop at Pushkin House, and I'm so pleased to welcome Marina, Sapritsky-Nahum, Alissa, Timoshkina, and Nadia Ragozhina for tonight's event. I'm just going to say a few words to introduce Marina, Alissa, and Nadia, and a little bit about their books, and then we can get started. Marina Sapritsky-Nahum is an honorary researcher at University College London and a visiting fellow at the LSE. She's a social anthropologist focusing on post-Soviet Jewish communities in Ukraine and its diaspora, with particular interest in religious revival and community building after state socialism. Since Russia's invasion of Ukraine, Marina has been writing about the effects of war on the everyday lives of Ukrainian Jews, both those who remain in the country and those who fled to Europe and the UK, as well as the fragmentation and remaking of historical narratives. Jewish Odesa is her first book and was published last summer. In it, she considers how the role of Russian language and culture, alongside memories of the Soviet era, have been critically re-evaluated in Ukraine's modern history, and how this has led to new forms of expression for Odesa's Jewish community. Alissa Timoshkina is a food writer and historian specializing in Eastern European food culture. She's originally from Siberia, and her family's Ukrainian Jewish lineage forms an important part of her culinary writing. Before turning to food, Alissa studied film history and gained a PhD in Soviet film and Holocaust history. In response to Russia's invasion of Ukraine in 2022, Alissa launched the Cook for Ukraine campaign alongside chef Olya Hercules. Her first cookbook, Salt and Thyme, was published in 2019, and her second cookbook, Kapusta, was published last week. In Kapusta, Alissa celebrates the vegetables that have shaped some of the most vibrant culinary traditions of Eastern Europe. Kapusta builds on Alissa's previous writing on Ashkenazi food and explores how her own identity was shaped by Jewish and Ukrainian food of her childhood. And Kapusta is also the Pushkin House Book of the Month this month. Nadia Ragozhina is a senior journalist at BBC News, and she's worked as an international news journalist and producer for over 20 years. Nadia's curiosity about her Jewish heritage and identity began when she was growing up in post-Soviet Moscow, and this led her to search for a missing branch of her family. Nadia followed the trail of her family history to Switzerland and was able to reunite her family and piece together stories hidden for generations. She recounts this journey in her 2020 book, Worlds Apart. So thank you again for coming, and thank you everyone for joining us, and we hope you enjoy the talk.
Thanks. Thank you, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. We're very excited to be doing this event, and thank you to Rachel, who's left the room, for the introduction. I have to apologize in advance. I have a very bad cough. It's not contagious, but I might cough. I will try to not have a coughing fit, but it might happen, so I apologize in advance. Today, we'll be talking about the Soviet Jewish experience and how language and food played a part in preserving heritage among different communities and in Russia and in Ukraine. Those communities were under pressure from the Soviet doctrine, from anti-Semitism and migration. We'll also discuss the new Jewish traditions that have evolved through the diaspora experience of migration, resilience, adaptability, and change. But before we begin, let's remind ourselves of some history. At the beginning of the 20th century, within the Pale of Settlement in the Russian Empire, where Jews were allowed to live and practice certain professions, there were 5 million Jews. That amounted to nearly 40% of Jewish population worldwide. In the Pale, Jews worked mostly in commerce and crafts. They spoke Yiddish, and their children went to yeshivas, Jewish schools. Newspapers circulated in Russian and Polish, Hebrew, and Yiddish, and there were religious communities, the Hasidim, as well as modern movements such as Zionism and the Socialist Bund. But the First World War, the collapse of the Russian Empire, the revolution, and the civil war in Russia destroyed the foundations of this Jewish world. Jews started moving in all directions, seeking for better opportunities and a better life, and many went to big urban cities that would soon become the Soviet Union. Before the Second World War, about 3 million Jews lived in the Soviet Union. The experiences of Jewish communities changed dramatically as the political environment changed around them, and many of those moving to big and small cities from towns in the Pale, chose modernity and left religious life behind, speaking Russian, choosing to speak Russian, and some changing their names. Many experienced anti-Semitism for decades to come, leaving their Jewish identities behind, and the language, food, and memories passed down to next generations in secret or away from prying eyes. With the collapse of the Soviet Union, and the Jewish experience has been changing once again. We're going to be discussing all this in the next hour, and we'll take questions from the audience towards the end, and we're looking forward to having your questions as well. There's a lot of history to bring in, but we'll also have personal stories from Marina and Alissa about their experience growing up in the Soviet Union and how those experiences shaped and influenced their writing today. I think it's important to start by stating that there was no one Jewish identity in the Soviet Union. And Marina, you write extensively about the question of Jewish identity in Odessa, often referred to as the most Jewish city in the Soviet Union. I'd like to begin by asking you how you first came to be interested in Odessa and in its Jewish history.
Hi, can everybody hear me? Hi, thank you. I left the Soviet Union when I was a child. I was 9 years old, and I always had this, oh, now it's louder. I always had this growing curiosity about the people who stayed and how their lives were shaped by all the processes of change that took place. I was specifically interested in the question of religious revival and wanted to understand how those new processes of religious revival, but also nationalism and democracy changed Jewish life on the ground. Odessa, as many people in the room probably know, has a very distinct and unique, beautiful Jewish history, but also Odessans have this profound love for their city. So I was immensely drawn to the place by this connection that people had to Odessa's specific Jewish history, but also its place in the wider world. Yeah.
And Odessa holds a special place for most Jews who grew up in the Soviet Union. The cultural narrative of Odessan culture evolved over many years, and it was often reflected in literature and popular culture. I remember growing up, I remember endless songs, jokes, films, books, ditties featuring Odessan culture. And I'm wondering, Alissa, if that's something that you can relate to.
Yes, absolutely. My family, as Rachel had in the introduction, comes from Ukraine, south of Ukraine, and actually some of the branches of the family is from Odessa, but I actually have never been there myself. I grew up in Siberia, but it really is a phenomenon how Odessa is almost this sort of spiritual home for the Jews across the Soviet Union, and probably wider in general as well. You know, you don't have to be Jewish to sort of relate to this unique Jewish quality of the city. And, you know, it was obviously popularized through cinema, culture, you know, TV. There were numerous sort of comedy shows set in Odessa and songs. And, of course, the Odessan Privoz, the very famous food market, that is just bursting, not just with flavors and ingredients, but also jokes. You know, there's millions of jokes that start with, you know, a vendor at a stall in a Odessan Privoz says something. So it's a really fascinating phenomenon that we all relate to.
Marina, is that something that you experienced when you were working and living in Odessa? Did you feel that mythical Jewish culture and the joie de vivre that, you know, there were so many stereotypes of?
Thank you. I was just following on Elisa's comment. I was just thinking how when I started to really bargain at Privoz, that's when my friends started to call me a real Odesitka. So I think Privoz is very central and continues to feature in this Odessan identity and its Jewishness as well. And most people would say that Odessan food is Jewish food and the other way around as well. So this kind of continuous connection between its Jewishness and its urban culture in general. Odessa changed a lot in the time that I lived there. I first came to the city in 2005 and then returned for further field work in 2014 and 2019. And obviously since the beginning of the war, Odessa has changed dramatically and continues to change. So So my experiences of Odessa were really different throughout the time there. But I definitely had moments where I felt like I'm living Odessa, that old Odessa of, hearing conversations on Deribasovskaya Street mingled with Russian and Ukrainian and Yiddish words, or, hearing Havanangela playing on the corner by street musicians, or, having somebody address me in this kind of very thick Odessan accent. You experience Odessa for all that you know it's for, but obviously that sort of thick myth of the place, that sort of constellation of images and histories is always part of our imagination of the place. And as one of my colleagues, Jared Tani, has said, the myth of Odessa is the history of Odessa. Now that's possibly an exaggeration, because the myth still differs from the history, but I think that in various parts of the city you feel it, you deeply feel it. And I've had those Odessa moments myself, yeah.
Alissa, you've also dedicated part of your life to studying Jewish issues, first with your PhD looking at how the Holocaust was represented in Soviet cinema, and now through your cooking and exploration of your great-grandmother's stories and recipes. How did you come to be interested in that part of your heritage specifically?
So I was really fortunate to benefit from this kind of social and cultural phenomenon of extended families living together in the Soviet era, and women in general tended to have children very young, so the generation gaps were quite small. So when I was born, my great-grandmother was only in her early 70s. And my parents were still at university, my grandparents were still working, and she was just recently retired. So she was the person who was actually looking after me. And eventually, when I can't remember exactly when, but maybe when I was 5, she actually moved in with us, and we shared a room. So she was the person who was there constantly. She was this wonderful, constant presence in my childhood. And she was the person who read me my first nursery rhymes with a very distinct Ukrainian accent. She was the person who fed me, who cooked for kind of most of the meals for me, and told me bedtime stories. And it was really beautiful how she, it wasn't, it's not a deliberate, I don't think it was a deliberate project on her behalf, but, how she transmitted so much more than just nursery rhymes and fairy tales. There was a real sense of history to her. She managed to tell me about her childhood as a little Jewish girl in the south of Ukraine. They lived in Crimea and then moved to Luhansk. She also obviously talked about the war. There's a really big sort of forming part of our family stories, the miraculous survival of the Holocaust and of the Nazi occupation of Ukraine. And, ever since I could remember myself, really, I was sort of steeped in that aspect of my family, and I really valued it so much. And I kind of realized that there's something, not secretive, but there was something very unique about it, that not all the children, not all my school friends shared that same experience. And then when I moved here, when I was 15, I went to school here, and given sort of that perspective and the distance that you often need to sort of reappreciate your origin and it really ignited a new interest in my family history. So I was exploring my great-grandmother's story and our Jewish lineage. Even doing A-levels, my photography art work was all about her, and I happened to be the last person to take the picture that I took of her for my art A-level were actually the last pictures of her ever taken. So it's a really, really special portrait, and she's sitting in her little kitchen at her table where, she spent years, cooking and baking, and it's just that image of her is, it's a real sort of symbol for me that I carry with me as a grown-up, and I just kept coming back to that narrative. I often think of my professional career as not having any coherence, because I sort of go from all this, one place to all these different places. But actually, if you think about it from the perspective of my family history, that is the connecting line that takes me from, a career in the academia, writing a PhD, to then suddenly switching to food and becoming a chef and a food writer. But that core is still there, and I always come back to her in different ways, and my PhD was dedicated to her, my first cookbook was dedicated to her, so she really has shaped me in such a significant way.
Thank you. We started by saying that there was no one unique Jewish Soviet experience. Karl Marx declared that communism begins where atheism begins, and Stalin cracked down on religion in the 1930s. That and anti-Semitism severely impacted those Jews who were still trying to maintain links to their Jewish practice. With religious life unavailable, Marina, what exactly do we mean when we talk about being Jewish in the Soviet Union, in your research experience?
Well, I think you partially answered that question at the beginning to say that there's not a one sort of monolithic thing that we talk about when we talk about Soviet Jewishness to start with. And I think it's important to, one of the things I was, keen to concentrate on is this urban sense of Jewishness that was specific to Odessa. And so it reminds us that Jews had very different experiences depending on where they lived. And I think an Odessan Soviet experience would have been different than a Siberian Soviet experience, and so on and so forth. So that's one thing to remember. I think generally social scientists have approached Soviet Jewishness as sort of a hollowed out identity, right? An identity dismissed, or rather detached from traditions, detached from Jewish knowledge and historical knowledge. And in a way, my project started from a different vantage point. I really wanted to understand specifically how individual Jews lived during the Soviet Union and what Jewish meant to them outside of this kind of broader picture of Elie Wiesel's notion of Jews of silence, right? So we know about the general context of Jews not practicing religion and in general being secular. We know about the fifth line in your passport that which stated your nationality as being Jewish. We know about the Jewish being a nationality in the Soviet Union. But there were obviously a lot more intimate moments in a Soviet Jewish experience, and this is where Alissa and I connect on these various private engagements of food and kitchen talk and conversations about family and migration and sharing a meal, which loosely marked the Jewish calendar, but nonetheless were there as a sort of continuing thread of Jewishness throughout the Soviet Union. So, another thing that social scientists often talk about is the sense of pride that Jews had in the achievement of other Jews. And this was, immediately felt in Odessa, where people felt not only proud of being Jewish, but proud of being an Odessan Jew, proud of being from that city specifically. And this is something that I think wasn't always understood by Western Jewry, who sort of could grasp why a Jewish person would stay in the Soviet, or sort of in former Soviet and independent Ukraine and other states, and why they wouldn't choose to immigrate and to live elsewhere. So I think that sense of value for the places where Jews lived as well also mattered in the Jewish experiences that people had. So.
Alissa, do you think that that relationship between the local Russian Jewish communities post the collapse of the Soviet Union and the Ukrainian Jewish communities and the global Jewish community, for many in the former Soviet Union, seeing a different mode of Jewishness being practiced was a revelation when that became possible? And I remember you speaking about that in reference to the Ashkenazi Jewish cuisine through the eyes of the West and being exported to New York, and how that was then presented to the Jews in the former Soviet Union.
Yeah, it's a really fascinating phenomenon, this relationship between sort of the inside and the outside of the local and the global community. In the context of the Soviet Jewish food, for example, or just, obviously food is so much connected to our identity. It's, the dishes that I grew up with, they were never, apart from matzah, but I think we're going to talk about that later, they were never coded as Jewish. It's just something that you eat and you love, and you associate that with your family, and especially the women in my family. And then once you move abroad, you suddenly become aware of this global network where these foods are actually coded entirely differently, and it suddenly becomes, this flavor, it suddenly becomes a marker of my Jewishness or a marker of my sort of communion with this whole global community that I never knew was there. And migration and Jewish food, they go hand in hand. They don't really, you can't, separate them. And what, even broader speaking, Eastern European food in general, what we in the West have come to appreciate as the classics of Eastern European cuisine, and it's still a very limited understanding and a very limited repertoire. These are all Ashkenazi dishes, borscht, spelled with a T, which is a Jewish Ashkenazi way of spelling borscht. Herring, you name it, dill, everything. Yeah, I mean, everything, really. The sort of the New York deli is the embodiment of Eastern European Jewish cuisine, and it only become that precisely because of the waves of the Jewish migration that started in the 19th century specifically and kind of continue to become a real global sort of foodie phenomenon. And it's a really fascinating thing that relates to so many other different cultures. If you look at Italian cuisine, for example, the way pizza, that has been always a very specific regional dish, suddenly became a global phenomenon once Italians started migrating to the States, and then it was sort of mirrored back to them as their national dish, and and it's the same thing can be said for all these kind of iconic Jewish dishes, that it's thanks to them crossing the ocean, then this new idea and the new identity was formed and then sort of brought back to the territory of Eastern Europe, where people started relating to them a lot differently.
And Marina, back in the Soviet Union, you write that food was often one of the safest ways of passing down family heritage down generations.
Yeah, I mean, again, this sort of notion of kitchen talk conversation is, was an intimate time and an intimate place for many families to discuss, family affairs and to discuss Jewishness and that kind of coded language of food, but also to teach the next generation about how to prepare it. So kitchen in general was a safe place to pass down traditions, because they were often very small and intimate, and you sat in sort of, close-knit connections, but you were also sort of engaged in a practice together. So because there was no public display of religiosity or public display of Jewishness in that way, kitchen Jewishness became sort of that intimate conversation about what it meant to be a Jew and what it meant to be, savoring these Jewish family traditions.
Yeah, I just wanted to add to that. There's a really beautiful book by Amos Oz that he wrote with his daughter called Jews and Words. And there he talks about how, Jews are the people of the book, and how language is, an essential way to keep that string, not necessarily religious string, but that string of identity together. And most of these conversations and the storytelling, it's really important to keep narrating the same stories and to keep telling your children the same stories. They all happen at the table, and most of the religious ceremonies, they are about storytelling and food. They go hand in hand. There's no way you can tell stories without tying food into it. And just reading that was such a beautiful kind of moment of recognition, where even though I did not grow up in a religious Jewish family, that sense of storytelling around the table and the food itself becoming that intimate, private language with which you pass on stories that you can't discuss openly, it was something that, I really could connect to. And this is what I love about food writing, is that you are able to use food as this beautiful, intimate language that so many people can relate to. And, everyone kind of reads something meaningful and personal into that dish.
One more thing to add. I mean, we had a conversation early, and one of the things that you had mentioned is that you had Jewish food without knowing that it was Jewish food. So I think another thing to note is that at times Jewish recipes were handed down without necessarily talking about them being Jewish recipes, and that was a sort of safe way to hand down Jewishness, to make that connection without necessarily articulating it. So I think sometimes it's the silence around it that's also made it a safe space.
Yeah, absolutely. And Alissa, you also have an example of how food served as a secret connection that sometimes helped you seek out other Jews in your community. Would you like to share that?
Yeah, I mean, there are quite a few stories like that. You know, one example that I keep thinking about recently is one of my best friends in my childhood they were a Jewish family. And again, it was never openly discussed that, you know, we share something that other kids in my building don't. But every time I would go to her flat, and we lived in the same block of flats, I would recognize the dishes that I don't see anywhere else in anyone else's kitchens apart from, you know, my own, my granny's, and theirs. You know, we were probably like 5 or 6, and obviously there was no sense of, oh, your mom makes gefilte fish, oh, that must mean we're Jewish. You know, obviously nothing like that happened, but it was really that I remember her mom making the gefilte fish and me kind of just thinking of my granny and, you know, just kind of intuitively feeling that there's something there. And then the other story that I love is my granny always received matzah. Again, as I said, we never practiced any religious holidays, so we never had Seder for Pesach, but we did receive matzah from her cousin in Moscow, kind of, I'm assuming it was around Pesach, you know, there was a very sort of specific time of the delivery. And we never displayed it openly, it was always sort of at the back of the cupboard. And then my mom had some kind of a seminar with her university lecturer. They were at her house, and the university lecturer was also Jewish. And while they were doing their work, I sort of toddled off somewhere, maybe I was 3 or something like that. And while no one was watching, I was just bored and I was going through the cupboards and I found matzah. So I ran out with a big sheet of matzah saying, "Mom, look what I found." And I was so excited. And the teacher was absolutely mortified. So I kind of outed her as a Jew to everyone. But luckily no one else picked up on that code, you know, what that sheet of dry bread meant, really. And sort of, you know, the incident, you know, my mom and the teacher kind of exchanged knowing glances, but then the incident was not sort of brought up in front of anyone else. So, you know, it wasn't as big a trouble for the poor teacher as it could have been.
Yeah, absolutely.
Can I share a matzah story?
Yeah, absolutely. We love matzah stories.
I think a matzah story is, you know, another intimate moment of Jewish cooking and Jewish identity. And besides having matzah in my own house, and again, I think that matzah appeared throughout the year, and you know, so it was interesting how it was very loosely marking the Jewish calendar, but the sheer fact of having matzah in your house identified you as a Jew amongst others. So that's quite interesting. But I also recall in Odessa, a lot of Jews told me that when they were little, they would go with their parents to drop a flower in order to make matzah in a specific place near the synagogue. And again, the parents didn't necessarily share with them that this was what they were dropping the flower for. And again, these sort of intimate conversations around food, but only later when they learned that this is where matzah was made and matzah was brought home, that they sort of, you know, were able to now, these stories that they tell their own children are now connected to that Jewish knowledge that they didn't have as kids, but they had the practice, they had the sort of, still that connective tissue of food and Jewishness in their lives.
Growing up, Marina, you said that one of the things that told you that you were Jewish, apart from the matzah, was all the talk of migration, that you had family members going to Australia, the US, Israel. And this is also something that you came across when you were doing your research in Odessa. Migration is a big part of the Odessa Jewish experience.
Yes, definitely. I mean, there's more Odessans that live abroad than in Odessa. So Odessa is big and wide and in many new places now. I was actually just discussing this with a friend of mine who's a photographer about doing a project called Little Odessas and sort of pushing on that idea that it used to be Brighton Beach in New York that was referenced as Little Odessa. And as a result of the war, you have Little Odessas spring up everywhere now. And what they look like is rather different, and the people that are making up these communities are rather different as well. Migration has identified Odessa throughout its history, of course. a big part of the Odessa's community, nearly 50,000 left during the collapse of the Soviet Union in the years to follow. So Odessa was left with a mere 30,000 Jewish community, which have now again sort of nearly have fled, some have returned, but it continues to be part of the story. When I first came to Odessa, I was actually also drawn by this phenomena of return migration. So Odessa has, as I mentioned, a large diaspora of people that love it, and a lot of them would come back annually. And a lot of them actually left apartments that they then rented out, but for 1 month of the year they would ask the tenants to leave, which is so abnormal if you think about it. Like, imagine your tenant was like, okay, during July you just have to go somewhere because I'm coming back to my home, right? But that's just what everybody did, and loads of people lived like that. They just moved to other places for a month or rented something else. So migration popped out in very interesting and different ways, and return migration too, and there was a number of people coming back also to start different ventures and permanently relocating. So this is really quite interesting. After having lived in many different countries abroad, they decided to come back and start their life in Odessa again. So it shaped Odessa in very different and sort of unexpected ways, but has always been part of this. I mean, everybody I knew had somebody, part of their family, who lived abroad, and I think that kind of global sense of ex-Soviet Jewry continues to define most families who grew up in the ex-Soviet states and Ukraine.
And there was also obviously the migration within the former Soviet space. And Alissa, you've touched upon your great-grandmother's journey from Ukraine to Siberia. Can you tell us a little bit more about why and how that came about, how she ended up in Siberia?
Yeah, of course. So they moved. So her husband was an engineer, and he was when the Nazis invaded Ukraine. The Soviet Union moved all of the assets, so all of the industry assets from the occupied zones to a safer places in Central Asia and Siberia. And he was taken together with his colleagues to a plant in Omsk, and that's where actually was born. And he had to leave his wife, my great-grandmother, and their son, my grandfather, behind. They realized quite quickly that, there's no way they can survive the occupation. Tragically, my great-grandmother's sister was taken away and shot. And my great-grandmother somehow had this, second or whatever, sixth sense that, she just has to get away from Ukraine. So she left her son, who was ill at the time, and he was only 5, so it was very dangerous and, complicated to travel with a small sick child. So she left him behind with the locals, and she walked, and it's an incredible survival story that she managed to, go from places to places. She's talking that she walked to Mariupol, so, they were in Luhansk, even though it's still part of the same sort of area of Ukraine, it's still miles and miles away. And, she was just so fortunate that she managed to find a passport, and because her documents were taken away with her original Jewish name, and she found a passport that had a woman who looked very similar to her. It was the same year of birth, so the age was the same, and it had a Slavic name, Yelena something. And she had that passport, which literally just saved her life, that she was actually able to, present it to people and travel and get some jobs, odd kind of чернорабочие, I don't know what the kind of labor works, here and there in farms and so on. And eventually that way she made her way to Omsk, reunited with her husband, and by that point the war was, or rather the occupation of Ukraine was over. And then they came back to find, luckily, that their son was still alive and well. He almost died of typhus, but survived. And for the next sort of 20 or so years, they lived between Siberia and Ukraine. And even when my mom was young and a teenager, they actually did move back to Ukraine, but for various reasons, they ended up going back to Siberia. So, there's always this sort of 50-50 chance if my family would have been in Ukraine. And, it's chilling to think what would have happened to us now with all of that area now under, this awful constant attack from Russia. So yeah, that's how we became Siberian.
But your grandfather had to hide as well while he was left back there during the occupation as well. Yeah. The Holocaust obviously weighs very heavy on the history of Jews in Europe. But Jewish communities in Russia and Ukraine were affected very differently by it. As you were talking about, Ukraine was occupied, most of Russia wasn't. But what was the impact of the Holocaust specifically on Odessa and the Odessan community?
Thank you. I think when we talk about the Holocaust, it's important to understand that in this Soviet narrative, there was no distinction in the kind of official public narrative about World War II. There was no distinction between Soviet casualties and others. So, in other words, Jewish or non-Jewish casualties. So, it was only regarded as sort of Soviet casualties without making that distinction. So, Holocaust wasn't a topic of conversation, topic of research, and things that, and was not part of heritage or public engagement at all. Odessa was occupied from 1941, from October to April 1944, by the Romanian troops who were collaborating with the German Nazis. So it has a very different, distinct history of being part of Transnistria. At that point, as Alissa mentioned, thousands were relocated to Central Asia. Some actually went to Russia. And this is quite interesting, actually. There's a project now called Exodus 2022, which interviews World War II survivors, Holocaust survivors, in comparing their fleeing stories of World War II and now, and draws this parallel of experiences. Altogether, I think an average of 120 to 150,000 Jews perished in Odessa, and around 250,000 perished in the greater area of Transnistria. So out of the Jews that remained, 80% were annihilated. And this obviously marked Odessa in a very distinct way. Odessa now has 3 monuments to commemorate the Holocaust, as well as an alley of the righteousness to commemorate the people that helped Jews. The Jewish Local Community Center organizes various programs for Holocaust survivors, for the ghetto survivors, including talks and dinners and even dancing, but also to receive reparations from the German government as well. So there's a Holocaust museum as well, and actually the gentleman who runs the Holocaust Museum just opened a museum of genocide connected to the war. So this is a new project that connects, again, the tragedy that we see in Ukraine now and the experience of the Holocaust.
Alissa, you've talked about your great-grandmother a lot today, and you've mentioned that she kept her Ukrainian accent when living in Siberia. I would like to talk about language now, because obviously Russian was the dominant language of the Soviet Union, and we'll talk about how that was reflected and what it was like for the Jews in Odessa and what it has been since the war. But before we do that, I'm just curious to kind of find out from you what it was like in your surroundings in the Soviet Union, having a great-grandmother who had a thick Ukrainian accent, and whether you're conscious of that now, but did you know it then, and how were everyone else perceiving it?
Yeah, it's interesting. I think I wasn't really aware of it, and it's something that I've become more aware of, again, since I moved here, and I've met other sort of native Ukrainians. My family, so there's also a Ukrainian side of my family that's not Jewish. So I was constantly surrounded by this unique sort of linguistic and oral kind of sphere that's mixed Russian and Ukrainian, and of course, you know, the songs and everything. Kind of the argument can go in the way that, you know, it was such a multicultural place anyway that, you know, there was no one actually made a big difference of the fact that you speak with a Ukrainian accent or you use some Ukrainian language in your words. And I think that's kind of is the sort of the side effect of living in empire where people are sort of stripped off of their identity, and you are in this sort of, on the one hand, it's celebrated, oh, look at us, we're so multicultural, but at the same time, you know, well, we're all Russians, and, you know, you don't really sort of speak out about your Ukrainianness or your Jewishness. So when I came here, I suddenly became aware that all these words that I grew up with, which I thought were just kind of our family's linguistic quirks or some kind of, you know, pet names for me or something, they were actually just standard Ukrainian language, and it was quite a revelation to suddenly think back. You know, it's astonishing. It was only recently, and I think the beginning of the war in 2014 with the annexation of Crimea, that was a real catalyst for, I think, people both in Ukraine and in Russia who have obviously connections to Ukraine, of really kind of waking up to your Ukrainianness and waking up to your lineage and understanding just how far it's been suppressed, that you're actually not aware of your own family history. And there was a massive shift in my brain. It's just a huge kind of reframe, suddenly realizing my grandfather was Ukrainian. Like, why have I always introduced my family as being Russian? Yet, you know, I happen to be born in Siberia, but kind of ethnically, culturally and linguistically, my family has always been very much connected to Ukraine. But I think Ukraine also is a very unique example because of Russia's emphasis on the fact that it's not a country, it's just a region of, you know, it's the Ukraine. And so you kind of think, well, yes, I have lineage from Ukraine, but that doesn't make me Ukrainian. That just, you know, it's still Russia. So it's really mind-blowing to realize how people are not in touch with that aspect of, you know, the key aspect of their identity, and how, unfortunately, how successful the Soviets and the Russian project, this imperialist project of erasure of people's authentic roots, how well it has worked. But, you know, luckily, of course, now, as I'm sure Marina can comment on, you know, this revival and this resurgence of Ukrainian, and I mean nationalism in the most kind of healthy, you know, non-sort of fanatical way. A healthy sense of nationalism and patriotism is reviving, but equally, you know, it's happening to the people of the diaspora, people who have left Ukraine for various reasons, like members of my family. And, you know, to me, it has been really important to stress the fact, you know, where my family is from and name them as Ukrainians rather than saying, oh, we're from Russia.
Do you want to? I know you have Ukrainian, Russian, and Jewish, heritage as well. So I'm just wondering, you must
Lithuanian,
have felt
Belarusian as well. So my family is Ukrainian, Belarusian, and Lithuanian. Yes, I think. I mean, first, it's important to say that language ideology changed greatly during the war. Since the beginning of the war. It's also important to note that historically Jews in Ukraine spoke different languages, not just Russian and Ukrainian, but Yiddish and Polish and even French and Hebrew and German. So we often forget that actually this place is very multilingual and has been part of many different empires that left its linguistic mark and cultural mark on its Jewish population. Odesa was predominantly a Russian-speaking city when I lived there, and I think in many ways it continues to be, but people's knowledge of Ukrainian and people's relationship with Ukrainian has changed greatly. I think everybody is aware of these kind of very stereotypical way of seeing Ukrainian as a kind of rural, you know, country bumpkin language, and Russian is this kind of cultural elite, tongue of intelligentsia. And as Alissa said, for a lot of people, this was, the war was a wake-up call. But I've also met people who had a very sincere and dear connection to Ukrainian music, to Ukrainian language, to Ukrainian literature, much earlier, and living there in the mid-2000s. So I think there's definitely been a major shift, and I see that through the people that I know personally who they might have not switched to speaking Ukrainian, but they definitely listen to Ukrainian music, they read Ukrainian books, they choose to write in Ukrainian and publicly have a Ukrainian face. But there's still a great mixture of languages that are there. I think English is becoming another really important language in Ukraine now, definitely among the youth as well. So I think Odessa has always been known for that mixture historically and today, and if anything, that love for Ukrainian has evolved and developed there and elsewhere, I think, in the country and abroad as well.
I guess that's part of the revival of Odessan Jewish experience of, changing the language and moving on with the changing environment around them. But I wonder if we can talk about the really fascinating debate that you write about of the revival of Jewish life in contemporary Odessa, with many older Odessans feeling that they're Jewish enough, having been born and raised in this Jewish cultural environment of Odessa's Jewishness. And with the collapse of the Soviet Union, it has been different with the global Jewish communities, organizations coming to the city and trying to introduce something that they were not expecting. Can you tell us a bit more about that?
Yes. So revival is a big part of my book in general. And I was always really interested in this kind of intergenerational conversations about Jewish experiences and Jewish identity. And so I was very often part of these engagements where the grandchildren or children would be teaching their parents or grandparents about the proper way of being a Jew, so something they would have learned at school or the local Jewish community center or in one of the camps that they attended in the summertime. And this is quite interesting because it was this complete reversal of this social inheritance, which is meant to be passed down from generation to generation. And here you have some, 8-year-old child saying, "No, Grandma, you're not doing it the right way." And besides sort of marking people of being proper and non-proper Jews, kids had a whole kind of hierarchy system. So they would tell me things like, "Well, my grandmother is not as good of a Jew as my neighbor because she watches TV on Saturday, but she's not as bad as my grandfather who believes in Jesus." So they had all of these sort of, various ways of qualifying who was a proper Jew according to the rules of halacha, which they would have only learned in the context of, organized Jewish education that followed with the breakup of the Soviet Union. But there were sort of, very comical moments of, a friend of mine, I'm thinking of a specific moment where my friend Igor goes to see his grandmother and he's wearing a kippah and he walks in and she says, "Must you tell everybody that you're Jewish? Why are you wearing this cap?" And he said, "Well, that's exactly the point, she went on to ask him, "When are you getting married? I'm so tired of waiting." And he says, "Well, I'm waiting for a nice Jewish girl." And she said, "Oh my God, in my days we married somebody because they were a good person, because they were read a lot, they were part of the intelligentsia, and what is this nonsense about wanting to marry somebody just because they're Jewish?" And would just storm out of the room, and this was really quite at odds with kind of this major process of transformation that we saw on the ground where global Judaism became local Judaism. And one of the things that I also really wanted to sort of voice in this book is, we can't look at it as sort of a foreign invasion in that direct sense. Yes, foreign Jews came and formed a lot of the organizations, but now we're talking about generational Jews who grew up in that life. We're talking about rabbis whose kids speak fluent Ukrainian and Russian and are very much part of the local context. So this kind of global Judaism became local Judaism in many ways. And specifically in Odessa, which is known for its kind of liberal reform traditions, the sort of now the dominance of Orthodox Judaism greatly transformed that space. And so elderly Jews would say, "Who are these Jews walking around in black coats and caps? They must be tourists or something, And they weren't tourists. They were sometimes, part of the local Jewish community, but they just had this, idea that Odessan Jews were different. They were sort of, the ones smoking on the corner on Shabbat or kind of, exchanging ideas in a synagogue. They would say, Rabinovich goes to synagogue to pray to God and I go to speak to Rabinovich. They had this...
There come the jokes.
Yeah.
We started with that.
So sort of, these interesting discussions, intergenerational discussions, were sometimes very comical, but always very interesting to follow.
Fascinating. We're almost approaching time for you to ask questions of our lovely authors. Before we go, I'd like to ask you both one question, same question. We've been discussing the Soviet Jewish experience. I would like to talk about the legacy of it. I know you both have children who are growing up in very different environments to your own childhoods as part of to different extents as part of the global Jewish community. But I'm wondering what you think is worth preserving from your Soviet Jewish experience. What would you like to pass on to them? How are you going to do that? And which aspects you think are not worth passing on and are better left behind?
I think to me, the very fact of having children is already a process of passing on something. As I've said, the miraculous survival of my grandfather is a real pillar of our family identity. And I remember when I was sort of thinking about having children, I've viscerally felt that sense that I kind of owe it to my family who have survived against all odds to continue our family line. It would be like, it's Elie Wiesel said, it's like killing the victims again if you forget about them. So the decision of having children was very much, obviously wasn't the only reason why I decided to have kids, but it was very much rooted in that sense already. And when I was pregnant with my first child, I was working on my first cookbook, and it was really special sort of delving into family stories and recipes and eating or feeding myself with my great granny's food and kind of having her symbolically next to me as I was changing and transitioning into this new crazy identity of a mother. So it's always been very much connected to food for me. And my kids are still very little. My daughter, who is very present today here, she is 6, and my other one, who you can also hear, he is only 1.5. So obviously there's no sort of engaged discussion of the phenomenon of Soviet Jewishness and the history and the complexity of it. But through the war in Ukraine, my daughter is, she's wonderful. She's very intuitive and very inquisitive. So she has been always interested in my work with Cook for Ukraine. And, she's very aware of what a Ukrainian flag looks like. And she even, bless her, she even coined that term when we're talking about our Jewish and Ukrainian families. So she said, so we're Ukrainian. And I thought this is perfect. And this is like my new, the name for our family identity is Ukrainian. And the Soviet Union, it's a really complex phenomenon. I think on the one hand, as a historian, and I have studied it professionally, I find it extremely fascinating, kind of intellectually and creatively and for various reasons. But on the other hand, seeing Putin for the past however many decades now talking about the Soviet Union and his absolutely mad project of reviving the Soviet Union, it's really important not to sort of slip into this nostalgic vibe, because so many people, especially the people in the diaspora, they have this very strong nostalgic sentiment towards the Soviet Union, but it's a really, really dangerous sort of thin line between lapsing into sort of pro-Putin stance and view of the world and the former Soviet space, as it's called, and just genuinely, appreciating a complicated historical period that we happen to be part of, or, happen to have an embodied experience of. So while the children are still little, food is my language with which I'm talking to them about our family story. My daughter has a little sense of that. Jews had a very difficult experience, and the reason why I'm so passionate about reviving, or rather, it was very interesting to read in your book, this whole idea of revival. It's not actually a revival because I'm not reviving anything from my own family, but it's actually being the first sort of step in our generational history to create these new traditions, precisely borrowing them from the global Jewish community and introducing them into our intimate family environment. So it's a real fascinating experience for us now, where we are at this sort of process of building something new that is obviously rooted very much in our personal history, but also very much borrowed from a more global community and kind of echoing the experiences of other people. So for now we're eating matzah, and it's really special. My granny always made the lovely omelette, the super simple omelette with matzah called matzah brai, which I actually didn't know that it's called that until very recently. It was just a matzah omelette, an absolute staple of Ashkenazi cuisine, and my daughter loves it. And I remember making it for her for the first time and getting really tearful when she was eating, and she was like, "Mom, are you okay? It's good, it's okay." And she obviously didn't understand why why I was getting tearful, but it was really emotional to see her eating my great-grandmother's food, you know, kind of separated by so many generations, but the food was still there.
I mean, food is definitely the thing to connect most parents to their kids. I think the other thing that is very important for me to pass down to my kids, and I have 5 kids, so this book is my 6th baby. So I had to think a lot about these processes of kind of social inheritance and what I'm giving to them and what they're giving to me as well. And also what I've sort of learned from my husband. My husband is a Sephardi Jew from his family is from Algeria and Tunisia, and he grew up in Paris. So we have very different histories, and he grew up in a very traditional family, observing kashrut and so on and so forth. But what I love to think with when I am mothering and thinking about, you know, what I'm actually consciously passing down to my kids from my experience of being born and growing up in the Soviet Union partially, is that sense of choice and freedom that they now have, and that things were different then, right? So what they have is connected to both my history and my husband's history, but ultimately they have a choice now of how they want to be Jewish and how they want to practice their traditions and their faith and their culture and their food heritage as well. So I think obviously family histories passed down through, you know, kitchen conversations, but also my father's recently published a book, wrote a book and published it for all the kids and grandkids. So these stories became also more formalized, and so these kind of more now formal stories of what life was like before the Soviet Union and during the Soviet Union are also extremely important, and something that I cherish and pass down to my kids, that Jewish experiences are really, really diverse, and I think having that enormous spread between Tunisia, Algeria, and the Soviet Union, my kids definitely see it as a global experience. Yeah.
Thank you very much, both. I will let Rachel moderate the Q&A, because I think we've heard enough of my questions, and I'd love to hear some of yours.
Can I ask one? I'd love to ask about the food. So what kind of food would you have on your table? Is it Sephardi or Ashkenazi? How do you mix the two?
That's literally what we do. We mix the two. So we have chukchuka, and then we have gefilte fish, and we sort of alternate. So we sometimes have Shabbats that are very Ashkenazi, and sometimes we have Shabbats that are very Sephardic. But they generally, the table is kind of a combination of things that are, you know, cabbage being a staple in my dish, and sometimes we take very Ashkenazi things and put a little bit of harissa on them, or add a little bit of a Algerian, Tunisian twist, or, you know, make a couscous but add vegetables, like different types of radishes that I grew up with, and so on and so forth. And I'll always add dill and peas to everything that I cook. So, you know, I think it's about kind of mixing, and that sort of is usually what our table looks like. Yeah.
Had the best
Farshmak, yes. Farshmak is another staple, yes. Yeah, Odesan cuisine has, you know, definitely made its mark in my household. Yeah.
Thank you so much for this discussion. It just felt very warm and personal. And listening to you, I've started feeling quite emotional myself, because I could relate to so many aspects of my childhood. And I'm really interested, you both mentioned, all three of you actually, about the erased identity, which was under threat. I mean, for my grandfather, he always says that during the Second World War, he was a fighter pilot, so he felt empowered, he almost didn't experience any anti-Semitism, but after the Second World War, during Stalin campaign against cosmopolitanism, it was possibly kind of the scariest part of his life, because everybody kept hinting to him at work and stuff, when Jews are going to be taken away, we're going to take your job or your flat. And then for me, it's very interesting how the secularism is started mixing with kind of religious tradition in the 90s. And I could relate as well when my grandfather started going to the synagogue, and he would always make a point on going to the rabbi and saying, well, I'm an atheist. And the rabbi was like, of course you are, but there are lots of snacks and there are lots of friends. Enjoy yourself. And then a few years ago, when I started researching my history, I realized that I found online that he was actually one of the founding members of the synagogue. So it was a very interesting juxtaposition. And so I just wanted to maybe, and now I guess my question is, one is the sharing of this, but another one is how now we're going through the period where all this Jewish identities are maybe once again scattered and needing to be reshaped in new environments because of the war and because of everything that's going on, and how it may lead to new dynamics, because you mentioned that in your research as well. The kind of the reshaping of the identity yet again.
I think Soviet and post-Soviet experiences are full of contradictions. So having an atheist in a synagogue is totally normal. You know, that happens all the time. I think Jewish life is greatly affected by the war in different ways. First, obviously, migration. So we have a great number of population that is abroad now, and initially went for 1 week, thinking that they were going to come back, thinking that this was a short-lived scare or it will end in a few days' time. And now 3 years into their life in Germany and Poland and the UK and the US, Israel and elsewhere, we're talking about families whose kids have now gone to school and learned those languages. And so there's a lot of a lot of new communities that are forming abroad, a lot of scattered families, a lot of broken communities, some communities that no longer exist because they've been destroyed in the war, both physically and through dispersion. But this also changed the dynamics of existing communities. And when I'm thinking about Odesa specifically, a city that I know very well, because of all the internal migration, you now have a lot of Jews who ended up in Odesa who are now part of these communities that are sort of, new members, and others who've never been part of Jewish life that have become active participants in community affairs. And community programs and synagogues in general became hubs of humanitarian aid. And so a lot of people went there initially to receive information, to receive aid, to receive assistance. And so that functionality of Jewish institutions have greatly changed during the war. And for some people, just being part of a community is what they needed psychologically and mentally to cope. So you also, a lot of social scientists are sort of picking up on the fact that religion we're kind of seeing a different revival in a way, because people are turning to religious institutions and centers of Jewish life, and not just in Judaism, but across all religions as well within the country. So you both have a kind of, dispersion and loss, but you also have this kind of, sense of creation and connection that we're seeing once again within Jewish institutions. Yeah.
Just wanted to share a story. I don't know if it's not exactly answering your question, but you've mentioned the post-war Stalinist reality for the Jews, which was, it's astounding to think for people who have survived the Holocaust, who have gone through the enormous effort of fighting the war, and then were faced with this absolutely horrific prospect of a local Holocaust. And I've recently learned about this phenomenon, and since the date that we are approaching also is Stalin's death and the Jewish holiday of Purim, I've learned about this phenomenon called the Purim Katan, like a small Purim within different communities of Jews. They have stories of other miraculous escapes that are very specific to the local community. So the Soviet Jews have their own Purim Katan, which happened with Stalin's death. So, when Stalin, before he passed away, he was very close to signing off essentially this massive deportation projects, and there were barracks already being built for the Jews in Siberia. And I mean, I don't know how, is there a bit of kind of mythology involved in it, but the fact that he was about to sign the documents, and that was happening at the end of February, and then he, as we know, he had a stroke and he was lying, dying for a couple of days. And the day of his death was actually at that year, it fell on Purim as well. So that particular date, the 5th of March, was a Purim for Soviet Jews. And something that I was really moved to learn about it. And the 5th of March, I think for many people in the Soviet Union, I mean, I wouldn't say we celebrate it, but it's definitely a date that we do acknowledge every year. And to me now, there's going to be a date to acknowledge as well from a Jewish perspective. So it's something that I sort of internalized and want to honor on annual basis.
Just one last thing I want to say about Jews living through the Holocaust and then living through Stalin's purges. A number of people who survived felt enormous guilt and also fear for how they would be interpreted and whether they would be seen as collaborators or traitors, and questions posed to them as to how exactly did they survive if others perished. So again, this also played a role into that sense of silence that people had around their Jewish identity, and that sort of inability to talk about what happened to them, and ultimately that sense of betrayal, as your grandfather experienced. And I've met people and have done other research outside of this book where we interviewed survivors from Regensburg, all women's concentration camp, and the women that survived were just, a lot of them still couldn't process and couldn't talk about what happened, but a lot of them that did share felt so betrayed by the whole project, and were such committed communists, and were such committed sort of, to that project of survival, that then, felt like they couldn't connect to anyone and anything around them. So, yeah, this was a shared experience, I'd say.
Thank you so much for this conversation. I'm Tom Deval. My great-grandfather left Odessa in the 1880s, and I just wanted, there's so many different Jewish Odessas. The Odessa he left was a very different one, and he was a rich banker. And then there's the Moldovanka Odessa of Babel, and then there's this kind of Soviet, rather fuzzy, nostalgic Odessa around people like Zhvanetsky. And I just wondered, Marina, if you could, and so this current, in my view, completely misguided current Ukrainian government project to sort of cancel Babel, Zhvanetsky, and the only Jewish writer who's suddenly acceptable is Jabotinsky. And I just wonder, hopefully this is just, is going to be sorted out. There's, consultations going on within Odessa, but how does, clearly a reframing is needed, a kind of de-Sovietization is needed, but there's also, seems to be a kind of, it seems to have an overcorrection, to put it mildly, going on, and just reflect how Jews in Odessa can navigate, they can sort of be proud of certain aspects of their Russian language culture without associating themselves with the worst aspects of Soviet culture.
Thank you so much. This is a really important topic of conversation. I don't know if anybody's followed, anybody who's not nearly as obsessed with Odessa as myself. But there was a recent law that was passed in Odessa to change 100 street name. Most recent law passed to change 100 street names and take down 22 monuments connected to the kind of larger processes of decommunization and de-Russification. And part of those figures were Odessan Jews. And so Tom is right that this process affected the Jewish community directly. And there were a lot of questions being posed, specific about Isaac Babel and Zhvanetsky and others, Varian-Burr, that, is this process of decolonizing Odessa ultimately erasing or taking something away that's quintessentially Odessan, right? And is it sort of targeted towards Russian speakers? And if so, how do we handle this necessary change in one perspective, but a sort of, as you said, almost sort of crossing a border into something that felt unnatural for a lot of Odessan Jews. And this was a really, I know a lot of the international community wrote about it. There was a public letter that went out with over 100 signatures asking the United Nations asking UNESCO to basically speak to Zelensky to have, not engage in process of decolonization, but actually to open up this conversation, this dialogue, and this process for local scholars, for local historians to be part of that, and to do that after the war. So a lot of people felt that this wasn't the right time to fight this battle, that this cultural war within the real war was too painful, too heavy, too complicated, and needed to have local involvement. So I think the dialogue was more about having local actors being part of that decision. And it has made people question about their relationship to language. And a number of people that I know who, again, speak both Russian and Ukrainian, just felt that this particular moment in Odessa's history was a really painful one for them. So we're all hoping that it resolves and evolves, and everybody wants ultimately the same thing, and in some way shares a lot of this kind of concern for the future of Odessa and how to preserve its uniqueness, but how to sort of also reflect on it and how to decolonize it from these sort of connectors that we've assumed as natural. But it's a big question mark. Yeah.
Hi, I thank you all. And my question is about how to reconnect, because myself and I know my friends in a similar situation, that I grew up in a Jewish family, but the only people that I know that are really Jewish are my direct family. And both of us would really like to connect more with the Jewish community. And you were saying about displaced communities and how there's like the mini Odessa and stuff popping up. And I was wondering if in your research you discovered places in London that you would recommend that we could go to and like meet other people and stuff.
Maybe we can chat after, or just come over to my house. Little Odessa meets there weekly, so but we can chat.
Yeah, JW3, a cultural center, and I not that I'm promoting the people I used to work with, but I worked for an organization called UK Jewish Film, which is a really lovely cultural organization that promotes Jewish everything pretty much through film. So they do lots of lovely events for young people, kind of drinks and film screenings and meeting directors. They also have the young people's filmmaking club. So they do lots of really lovely creative events specifically to do with film. So do check them out.
Hi, I'm Sarah. Thank you so much for the talk. I'm curious, so I grew up in a very Christian area, and my family was one of the very few Jewish families in the area, but my family is very not religious, but it was the same thing of like all this food was in my household that I didn't really connect, and then took a while later and after leaving to be like, oh yes, like this is all Jewish food, like no one else has gefilte fish in their cupboard. But I'm curious because especially because I'm American but live here, and especially as there's been so much anti-Semitism that has grown, it really propels me to want to connect with the Jewish heritage, but also not as much from a religious standpoint, more from the cultural standpoint. But then it feels like there's such a hard break between the two. Like it's so hard to make the break between the two, and especially like I am constantly in circles where I'm the only Jewish person. I'm expected to know exactly what every single holiday means and every single this, and like I'm curious your thoughts on like embracing it from the cultural and the food perspective and all these different things, while also still like I guess being true to yourself and your beliefs and things like that as you navigate it.
It's a great question because this is something that I've been going through as well. for me, because I'm an atheist and I'm not into religion or kind of organized religion as such, but at the same time, sort of the more I read, I feel like we're free to make up our own narrative and story and finding a connecting point. Of course, there are lots of different approaches where people prefer to be very much by the book and follow all the rules and be part of a very specific community. But, I think London has that beauty that you build your own families, you build your own communities, and our identities are very fluid, and that's what I loved reading in your book. It really reminded me of that sense, because I often have these sort of moments of angst thinking like, who am I? I have all these weird labels that often don't fit together. But then actually reading Marina's book, it suddenly felt, oh, actually it's fine. That's how it is. We're all fluid. Our identity is constantly shifting depending on where we are, who we are with, what we're doing. And to me, obviously the history and the food is such a big part of my professional and personal interest that, these are my entry points into the Jewish lineage, into the Jewish, larger family. And religion, obviously, is a very problematic issue, but at the same time, there's so much profound beauty in the spiritual and almost philosophical part of it. So to me, I really connect to the philosophical aspect rather than the strictly so religious. And also, I've been looking at different communities, and it's so also very diverse, and it's so liberal in so many ways that you can really find, if you really want to be part of a more sort of organized religious community, there are so many different modes of this community as well, and London is a fascinating place for that. There's so many different synagogues, so many different community centers that sort of I'm sure you can find one where you feel at home.
And also, I think that there's a distinction we make between orthodoxy and orthopraxy, that you could practice without, you believe in what you want to believe during any practice and any ritual, but I think that's such a beautiful thing about Jewish traditions, is that they have these, connections, cultural, philosophical, historical, familial, and whether you draw on religion or not is really a personal choice. My husband, who, as I mentioned, grew up kosher in a very traditional household, doesn't believe in God. And so, and most people probably think that he's religious. And so that's what's sort of, interesting about these personal Jewish stories. You're never alone. The mixture with which we choose how we connect to our Jewishness is unique and individual, but also always connected to others. There's kosher light, which is people choosing various ways to be kosher. My son just gave a presentation at school about kosher food, and I asked him yesterday, what did you talk about? And he said, well, I talked about the way that every person tweaks and twerks, their kosherness. I said, oh, really? That's so interesting and elevated. But that's sort of such a great way to open it up, I've spent a lot of time with very traditional and working with Orthodox communities as well. I've also worked with Reform communities and completely secular Jews, and did life history with elderly Jews who, they looked at what religious Jews and religion in general with such level of suspicion that it was really intriguing and interesting to see. So there's, that sort of different mixture of vinaigrette type of style of options have always existed and always will. So I think find what works for you, and there'll be like-minded people for sure.
Any more questions from anyone?
Yeah, thanks so much. Sorry, mine's a bit of a different tone, but you mentioned that in the sort of official Soviet narrative of the Holocaust, it was just sort of part of the general Soviet losses in the war. How was that done in sort of at a family level? Was it still passed down sort of what the Jewish population went through, or was it more sort of ignored in a way, and how did that then sort of get resolved later?
Thank you. I think it depends on what your experience was. I think in general, some Jews, when telling their stories, would tell it from a Soviet perspective. So they would say, I experienced the war as a Soviet soldier, right? And it wasn't just about a sense of loss. A lot of Jews felt a sense of pride for their accomplishments in the Soviet Union. So we must not forget that. And I think the erasure in that kind of official Soviet narrative wasn't just towards the Holocaust, but also towards any specifically Jewish sense of accomplishments as well. So I think on a familial level, obviously, those intimate kitchen conversations were much more open, and they were discussed. Don't forget that a lot of people didn't know what was going on in the kind of larger context of the world, and even in their country, in their city sometimes, because of that sort of inability to share, but that inability to see it kind of publicly acknowledged. So I think it depended on what your experience was, but there was definitely more openness vis-a-vis family members, but some Jews just stayed silent because of their own personal trauma as well.
And just to add to that, on a broader level, outside of the Soviet Union as well, the process of acknowledging, remembering, and documenting the Holocaust was very complicated. There were so many different phases and stages. Documenting trauma is a very complex, social and cultural phenomenon for so many reasons, from personal inability of the survivor to put their experience into a narrative, but also, of course, as a wider society that just came out of the shock of the Second World War. The Holocaust in general, even in the countries in the West that were not openly anti-Semitic like the Soviet Union, it took a while to actually realize that there was a distinct Jewish experience to the war, and the project of the Nazi persecution, was a real thing. But whereas, of course, in the West, it took maybe 20 or so years to, find the terminology, find the witnesses that were willing to talk about it. In the Soviet Union, it took a lot longer, and it's only in the late 80s with the Gorbachev's policies of glasnost and perestroika that people actually began to revisit the war and the Stalinist era in general. And through that, there was this new sort of light that was shining through all these stories, where people started to understand that actually there was a distinct experience of the Jews. And of course, during the Second World War, there was an anti-fascist committee which was working. It was consisted of prominent Jewish intellectual figures, most of whom were then shot as part of the doctor's plot and so on. So there was this black book which was compiled during the war that never was published, but luckily there were some documents that were there to finally be unearthed in the late 80s. And then there was this huge wave of sudden realization that Jews in the Soviet Union, while also obviously sharing a lot of the fate of the non-Jews and fighting in the army and so on, there is a really unique distinctive story of Jewish Soviet victimhood, but then the story sort of keeps going up and down with different sort of modalities and different relationship to Israel, different relationship to the West in general, and obviously tellingly the recent anniversary of Auschwitz, Putin was not invited to that. So again, the Jews in Russia are finding it difficult, I would imagine, to voice their personal experiences.
I think we've got time for one more question if anyone has one.
Thank you so much for your talk. I was wondering if you think there are any Jewish food that have sort of transgressed into English food, from like Ashkenazi or Sephardic or Mizrahi sort of. I've heard rumors of like fish and chips actually being a Sephardic Jewish food. But if there's anything else that's is current and maybe you've discovered through your research.
Bagels for sure is a big one. Yeah, and I love that example of fish and chips, something that is an absolute sort of quintessential British dish, actually has a Sephardic Jewish origin, and it's just a wonderful reminder that food is not a solid thing, and that if you go far back in history, far back enough, you will find a completely different narrative, and your food is likely to have come from somewhere else. And it's just a really healthy reminder not to get sort of territorial and claim ownership over anything, really. Just share it. Food is there to be shared.
I think you can find challah in many grocery stores now and bakeries, so that's another one that I would say generally.
I was very interested in, I think it was your question, but you talked about it too, about the topic of migration being very current in Soviet Jews' family conversations. And I was very struck by this when I was working on a documentary about Stalin and went to school in Moscow to ask about, you know, how they were teaching history and everything. And afterwards, the teacher was interviewed and talked to us about how the Jewish children in the class had a very different outlook about Soviet history even than the Russian children, because somehow through their families they were less invested in it. There was always this option that they could leave. And I wondered whether, you know, my experience of Jews in the Soviet Union was that it was always a totally negative thing. It was all shaped by their experience of anti-Semitism. There was nothing kind of positive about being a Jew at all. So I really wondered if you could comment about whether, you know, that affected how people lived as Jews after the end of the Soviet Union. You know, and how many left and why the ones that stayed. And the aspect actually of not being religious. You know, I remember hearing stories about how they'd spent, you know, a lifetime in their family trying to get a Russian name so that the 5th point in the passport said Russian. And then they're emigrating to Israel and trying to, you know, rustle up documents from generations ago that, you know, somewhere someone was Jewish.
No, this was actually an ongoing joke in Odessa. They said we used to hide our documents to say that we're not Jewish, and now everybody's trying to kind of inscribe a Jewish nationality somewhere along the line in order to go to the local Jewish camp. So this definitely, you know, the investment that World Jewry has made in reviving Jewish revival on the ground and organized Jewish life in general has flipped the kind of desire to be Jewish, let's put it that way. I think that Jewish experiences, as I mentioned, in the Soviet Union were really diverse and connected to migration in many ways. But don't forget that for most of the Soviet period, very little Jews could actually leave the Soviet states. And so that really became kind of a conversation in the 70s for the first time, and then, you know, late 80s and 90s, so very late in the Soviet Union. But there was, there was there was still a lot of conversations about people and the possibility and the question. So one of the things that I write about in migration is that it's not just the process of actually leaving a country, it's the thought process of to go or not to go, to stay. We had to stay, we wanted to stay, coming back. It's a very complicated and very diverse experience for people. I mean, interestingly, like in the context of the war, I was interviewing a woman who works with heritage, works in kind of the realm of heritage studies in Lviv, and she said to me, you know, it was interesting, when we saw that the Jews stayed, we realized, we just thought they would all just go to Israel or go somewhere else because they could always go somewhere. But the fact that they stayed really showed us that Ukraine is their home. And this was really an interesting observation that I think a lot of people didn't necessarily grasp. And also when we talk about the people that stayed after the fall of the Soviet Union, there was a sense of puzzlement, like, why would you stay? It was so awful. They either, like I remember this colleague of mine saying, we only have two scenarios. They're either beating you with a bat on top of your head or you're packing your suitcase to go, right? But in actuality, I think Jewish experiences were different, but also kind of wider Soviet experiences were very diverse. And people did have, this sense of connection to the values, to their neighbors, to that sense of proximity they had to one another. Different aspects of their life were beautiful and very meaningful to them, despite the fact that it was part of this kind of larger system that they felt betrayed by or they hated. These personal stories are always much more elaborate about the Soviet experience, and I think Jews also had, beautiful times and experience, and many felt very accomplished for the, what they managed to do, and so on and so forth. So, yeah.
Can I just add something? And this is something we didn't quite get into, but I wanted to talk about the intelligentsia connection to the Jews, because a big proportion of Jews became part of the intelligentsia. I think there was a lot in that concept that appealed to the Jewish tradition of education. And so those who came to the big cities and they learned, they switched to Russian, they educated themselves, and the aspiration was to become members of intelligentsia. And for them, that was kind of their definition of being Jewish almost. So they knew that for them leaving would mean not having the same status abroad. You know, I know someone who was, you know, probably not very politically correct to say this now, but was shocked to discover that in Israel Jews work as, you know, work in professions that wouldn't be considered by a member of a Jewish intelligentsia in the former Soviet Union, in kind of post-Soviet Moscow. And I think there's a lot kind of to consider there, and I'm thinking back to my own kind of upbringing and what people I was surrounded by did. I think there is a lot about staying with your status, having the job that you have achieved and worked hard to. But I think it was that connection that we discussed as well, the local Jewish, the local post-Soviet Jewish community connecting with the global Jewish community, and it was a revelation on both sides. You know, the Western Jews didn't expect to find some of the things that they found in Odessa, but also for Soviet Jews, they were very surprised by some of the things that they discovered in the West. I think that's maybe partly why some of them were happy to stay and maintain that life.
Yeah, I just wanted to add from a personal experience that, I mean, I think obviously it's a phenomenon of migration anyway, and uprooting yourself from, no matter how difficult your life can be, you still have a sense of, you know, it's your comfort zone, even though anti-Semitism is part of that picture. And so when my family, we did move to Israel in the early 2000s, and it was precisely that picture of suddenly finding ourselves surprised to sort of be in a completely different social dynamic where you are suddenly a minority, and not in, you know, deliberate sort of, you know, there was no sense of discrimination. It's just a natural thing, you know, you become part of a Russian-speaking diaspora, and precisely, you know, knowing friends back from Russia who held different jobs and, you know, now had to drive taxis, and, you know, but you say that about the States as well, you know, that's just that phenomenon of migration where you can no longer have that same status, and for some people it was difficult. You know, either we have friends who drove the cabs, and then eventually they, you know, they learn Hebrew well enough to certify their medical diplomas, and now they work as doctors, and they sort of got back to their eventual status. My family hasn't been able to find its footing, so they went back, and, you know, we only lived in Israel for 4 years or so. But it's definitely a fascinating thing about, you know, the Jews in Israel, especially in the Soviet days, you know, since the creation of Israel, suddenly, you know, the life of the Jews became even more horrific, because now they were seen properly as the spies of another state, and this idea that you have a choice, you know, you have another homeland, you have an opportunity to leave, but actually on the practical level, it was next to impossible. You know, this whole story of refuseniks and Natan Sharansky, you know, it's become an emblem of the Soviet regime that is stifling Jews and denying them their birthright to migrate to Israel. So, you know, that sort of story still continues to be very, very problematic.
Okay. I would like to say a huge thank you to Marina, Alissa and Nadia for being here with us tonight and for this conversation. And thank you everyone for coming. We have copies of everyone's book downstairs for sale, and if you would like to stay with us for a drink at the bar, you would be more than welcome. So thank you everyone for coming.